take this opportunity to thank the sponsors of this program at research institutions in general and particularly at private schools. The type of events that we are having this evening is impossible to do on our own dimes, unfortunately, and we rely heavily on the sponsorship of our friends. And so this evening, I want to thank in particular Bank of America, who joined us this year as the presenting sponsor of the series, and we appreciate their support for our series, obviously. We have a few additional sponsors, and the First National Bank of South Miami is also a sponsor. We have a couple of individual sponsors that happen to be also on the board of visitors of the school. So Bill Galway and Cheryl Gold. Another contributor, the Shepard Broad Foundation. We have the Key Biscayne Community Foundation and John McCaffan Foundation. And thanks for them as well. We have Melissa and Taylor White, Marilu and John Dasberg, the Wang family, who is here also regularly, and always a pleasure to see them, and the Southern Glazers Wine and Spirit. We have a few noticeable guests this evening, including the Vice Mayor of the village of Key Biscayne, Frank Kaplan, okay, who is here with us. And a great friend of the school, and we have been working together for a few years, and we plan to continue working together with the village and continue this interaction with Frank. We have also village council members, Louise de la Cruz and Alison McCormick, and Miami-Dade County Commissioner Daniela Levin-Carva that is in. So the evening is going to be clearly about climate and climate change. And I would be remiss not to emphasize some of the research that is going on at the school. I would say that without hesitation, probably 1/3 to half of the faculty that we have at the school, one way or the other, is working on climate and climate change issues. And it would take too much time to list everybody, so I'm not going to do that. But really, the spectrum of projects that we are focusing on climate is extremely broad, and it goes from marine conservations and weather and sea rise, obviously. But it takes also into consideration aspects like social sciences and the related impact of the climate. So please take time to follow us on the web and come to the school and try to learn more about the school and possibly become a sponsor of the school. You know, we would certainly appreciate that as well. So we have started also recently a tradition. Before the main speaker, we ask some of our student alumni or current students to come and speak to you about the school and their experience at the school. So this evening, it's my great pleasure to introduce Jonah Infanti. And Jonah received a Bachelor of Science in Atmospheric Science from the University of Massachusetts in 2010. And she received her PhD in 2016 from the Rosenstiel School. So she worked with Professor Ben Kurtman, that many of you know, on a dissertation focusing on prediction and predictability. And for most of you, it sounds very much the same thing, especially when emphasized in the context of this presentation. But there is, in fact, a big difference between the two. So Jonah worked on that and clarified many of the issues. Since then, because she loved it so much at Rosenstiel, she decided to stay, and she did a postdoc here, and now is working on the joint project that still involves the Rosenstiel School with the United States Geological Survey and Florida Atlantic University on precipitation for Everglade restoration. So Jonah, if you would.
Thank you, Dr. Avasar, and good evening, everyone. I'm really excited to be here, and I'm more excited that you all are here to be able to listen to our wonderful speaker tonight. Like what was just said, I started my science journey, I guess, in 2006, and I went to University of Massachusetts in Lowell, and then I took this little trip down to University of Miami with my husband, to my now husband, and my cat actually sitting on the front seat of my car, where I studied at Erasmus, and I got my PhD in climatology in 2016. And now I work for the PACE Postdoctoral Fellowship Program, which is the Postdocs Applying Climate Expertise Fellowship. And I'm actually still working at Erasmus, working with Erasmus, Florida Atlantic University, and USGS because I just couldn't leave. And the project that we're working on is something really cool, and I wouldn't have been able to do it, I don't think, without Erasmus being in my background, and we're working on increasing confidence in precipitation projections for Everglades restoration. So I will admit that a little bit of this decision to come to University of Miami was made right after a particularly cold winter in New England, and possibly a little bit of the decision to stay. But I chose Erasmus because really the moment that I sent my first email to my advisor, Dr. Ben Kurtman, he was incredibly excited to talk to me. He emailed me back immediately, and he was just so enthusiastic about the school. And I had actually planned a visit here outside of recruitment weekend and outside of anything organized just to meet with Ben and meet with actually Laura Bracken, who was willing to not only give me a tour of the school, but also help me out with any of the questions I had about Miami in general and moving here. So sort of the first impression that I got was just an awesome first impression. And it just showed me that everyone was incredibly enthusiastic about the program and campus and how willing everyone was to help. And that really didn't change for the entirety of my time at Erasmus. When I first started here, I was incredibly shy. I had really no idea what I was doing, which is a feeling that I'm sure is incredibly familiar to any new student starting graduate school. But what I found here was a community of people that was extremely willing to help and extremely supportive. And that's the way that I have come to think of Erasmus, and it's of a community. So I guess the biggest impact that Erasmus had on me was that I was able to come out of my shell a bit and kind of become the person that I am today. And of course, the bar that we have on campus doesn't really help either. So one of the things that I really love about Erasmus is the opportunities that are available. So while Erasmus really prepares you incredibly well for a career in research, it gives you the opportunity to branch out. A lot of things can be done in an interdisciplinary setting. You can really make your time at Erasmus something really great. So I did do my PhD on seasonal climate predictions, which have a lot of applications for a lot of climate data users and a lot of people outside of the field of climatology. And during my PhD, I was able to work with some of those people in an interdisciplinary setting. And that was a really great experience, and it helped me shape some of the things that I've worked on now in my postdoc, where I'm still working with the University of Miami. So when I started this fellowship in 2017, I felt more prepared than I ever thought that I could be, just because of some of the opportunities that were available at Erasmus. So what I do now is I work with a lot of scientists from a lot of different disciplines and organizations around South Florida. I work with ecologists, I work with hydrologists, I work with sometimes the South Florida Water Management District, I work with USGS, and et cetera. And what we hope to do through this postdoc is to make some of the climate science that we work on here at Erasmus more accessible to these climate data users and scientists from other disciplines. And that's really cool in and of itself, but what is really happening is something incredibly cool, and that's this interdisciplinary, interactive interdisciplinary movement that drives some of the climate science research questions that I want to answer. And that's done through this interaction with some of these users. So the pictures that I'm showing here are from a workshop that we held somewhat recently that brought together about 40 scientists and resource managers, all with a common goal of Everglades restoration, and it facilitated that exchange that was related to climate data user needs and climate scientists here at Rasmus. So all in all, my time at Rasmus was an incredible learning experience for me, and I hope that I can share that learning experience with some of the people that I'm working with in my postdoc now. And Rasmus was really instrumental in preparing me to be able to do all of this work. Not only through the research that I did, but also through things like attending sponsored workshops on even things like presentation skills, which is something that Rasmus offers to the students here, which is just great. Classes that are outside of the field of climatology. It was just provided such a huge interdisciplinary opportunity. So all in all, Rasmus has been a really great experience, and that's opened a ton of doors and made me basically the best person I can be. So I'm really excited to be here, and again, I'm excited that you're all here as well, and you're able to share this experience with us tonight. And thank you, everyone. Have a great night.
And now I have the pleasure of introducing you to our featured speaker, Jeff Goodell. And we will be joined by Miami Herald environmental reporter Jenny Staletovich, right? Did correct this time? All right, to discuss his recent book, The Water Will Come. So Jeff received his degrees in English from USC Berkeley and graduate school at Columbia. His most recent book, The Water Will Come, Rising Seas, Sinking Cities, and the Remaking of the Civilized World, was a New York Times Critics Top Book of 2017. He's a regular contributing editor at Rolling Stone and the author of the previous books, including How to Cool the Planet, through Geoengineering and the Audacious Quest to Fix Earth's Climate, and Sunnyvale, a memoir about growing up in Silicon Valley, which was a New York Times notable book of the year. As a commentator on energy and climate issues, Jeff has appeared on pretty much every radio stations and TV, NPR, MSNBC, CNN, CNBC, ABC, NBC, Fox News, and Oprah Winfrey show. I probably forget a few. Jeff, and that I mentioned. And Jenny is the environmental reporter for the Miami Herald, a job that she took over in 2014 after several years of a freelance reporter. From 1999 to 2000, Jenny worked at the Palm Beach Post, covering COPs, government, and general assignment. She reported on the region major stories and issues, including hurricanes, the death penalty and prisons. She visited Haiti and Cuba to report on immigration issues. She has won several state and national awards, including the Scripps Award National Journalism Award for distinguished services to the First Amendment, the Green Eye Shades, and the Sunshine State Award. And Jenny graduated from Smith College and lives in Miami with her husband and 3 kids. Please welcome everybody, Jeff and Jenny, to the stage. Thank you.
Are we on?
Yep.
So what should we talk about? I'm kidding.
Water.
Right. So I'm curious how you got to climate change and this issue. I know, I think, was it 2013 that you wrote the first Rolling Stone article that made a big splash down here? And so what, was that an assignment from your editor or what? And in the book you mentioned that it was trudging through floodwaters in Miami Beach where you first sort of realized that, you know, we were at a critical point.
Yeah. So let me first say I'm very happy to be here.
Okay.
And very happy to be talking with you. And very happy to see so many familiar faces here tonight. I spent a lot of time here in Miami while I was writing and reporting this book. And many of you in this audience were incredibly helpful to me, including many people here at Erasmus. One particularly memorable moment for me was I was trying to get my mind around the consequences of sea level rise here, and Cheryl Gold, who's one of the co-sponsors of tonight's event, said, "You really should see it from a helicopter." And I was like, "Well, that's an interesting idea." And she said, "I can take you up." And I'm like, "Really? You can fly a helicopter?" And she said, "I'm learning." And I said, "Huh?" I said, "Is it just going to be me and you?" And she said, No, Doctor, I'm sorry. We'll be at the controls also, helping us out." So we went up and took a tour of the coast here, and it was a very memorable event, kind of being able to see the landscape and the coastline from a helicopter. So I'm very grateful to you both for that moment. So how did I get to this? I got to this very circuitously, as most things in my life. I have been covering climate change for a while, since around 2000, when I wrote a cover story for the New York Times Magazine about the comeback of the coal industry during the George W. Bush administration. And one of the things that became very clear to me during reporting that story was that we had a lot of coal in the world and we're not going to stop burning it anytime soon. And what are the consequences of that is climate change, obviously. And so I started writing about climate change and thinking about it. And I wrote about many aspects of it. And I kind of knew about sea level rise, but like most people, it was sort of this background thing. It's like, a few feet by the end of the century or whatever. And then Hurricane Sandy hit New York. And I wasn't in the city for Hurricane Sandy, but I went down there the next day and saw what 9 feet of storm surge did to lower Manhattan. And it was a very visceral thing for me. And I was talking to some scientists at Columbia and trying to think about how to write about this. And one scientist said to me, "You could think of this as a sort of dress rehearsal for sea level rise, because 9 feet is sort of the high end of what we might think about by the end of the century. And imagine that 9 feet of water that came in, instead of going out in 2 hours or so, just stayed there, and that's what it would look like." And then he said, "If you really want to blow your mind, go have that same thought experiment in Miami." And I was like, "Why?" And he said, "Go and you will see." So I went, and I came here during king tides, and I saw. And it took me, as it wasn't very complicated to think about what the consequences for a place that has so much real estate right on the water, that is so flat, that is built on porous limestone. Didn't take long for me to see what the consequences of this would be. So I wrote that piece for Rolling Stone called, subtly titled, "Goodbye, Miami."
What was the response to that? I'm curious.
Well, the realtors loved me.
Yeah.
The response was, this variety of response, but there was a certain percentage of people who said, you're being hysterical and the science is wrong, and there's all range of there's the whole climate deniers that didn't think it was even happening. There's another kind of climate denier who says we'll have some technological fix for this. So there was a range of response, but it was comparing the response then to now. There's been a real advance in talking and thinking about this here. At that time, really, I don't really know that anybody was really talking about it in a, kind of existential way that we're beginning to think about it now. So I was very happy to kind of kick off that conversation.
Right.
But it made me start to think about, okay, well, what about other places in the world? And
was Miami then your first stop on what would take you literally around the planet?
Right. So I thought, Miami's in this kind of trouble. What's going on in the Netherlands? What does this mean for Venice? What does this mean for the Marshall Islands? What does this mean for China, for Indonesia? How are other cities around the world dealing with this? what does this, I needed to understand sea level rise and the consequences of sea level rise. You need to understand what's happening in Greenland and Antarctica. So I went there.
How did you pick the places? Had you heard that they were vulnerable, or there were things going on there that would, you need a story, so you need something to be happening?
Yeah. I mean, it's hard when I'm trying to write a book about like how it's going to change the world, and so you kind of have to narrow your targets down a little bit. So some places were no-brainers. I mean, Miami was a no-brainer simply because there's so much at risk here, and it's such a sort of interesting place for this conversation politically and for many obvious reasons. New York was an obvious subject for me to write about because of Hurricane Sandy and because, again, of all the real estate value there on the water. But then Netherlands is an obvious example of a place to think about because they've been dealing with flooding and rising seas. 60% of the country is below sea level, so they've been dealing with it for a long time. Marshall Islands were very important because the Pacific Islands and islands all around the world are really at a kind of existential risk. They're not worried about their like hotels going under or their condos on the beach going under. They're worried about their entire country vanishing beneath the water. And they're asking themselves questions like, well, if we all move to, some land in
Isn't there
Australia
someone
or
offering them
Fiji.
refuge?
Yeah, but so if we all go to 600 acres on Fiji, are we still the Marshall Islands? Or what are we then? Are we just refugees? And can we create a virtual nation with our nation? So there's lots of really interesting psychological and conceptual questions with the islands. And then, I needed to go to think about this. It's just not a developed world, rich world problem. It's a developing world problem. And so there were many places I could have gone. Bangladesh is obviously a place where there's a lot of people at risk, but I chose to go to Lagos, Nigeria, to write about people living in the water slums there, which was a very interesting place for me, where I really understood there that the problem with sea level rise is human infrastructure. Sea level rise is not a problem it would not be a problem on Miami Beach if Miami Beach were still a sand barrier island. The problem is that we have built a lot of roads, a lot of valuable real estate and stuff there that is not easily movable. And in Lagos, people live in these water slums and they live on houses on the water, not so different than Stiltsville. And I was thinking of the sticks in Lagos. But so they have their houses on poles, right? And they just, you talk to them about 4 feet or 5 feet of sea level rise, they're like, okay, we can fix it in an afternoon. We can put our poles a little higher and we'll be fine. They're just like, what's the big deal? Don't you have something else to talk about?
There's also more pressing problems. I remember the part of the book where you talked to one of the guys and he said it's not sea rise, it's the government.
Right.
And
Yeah, they're worried about
there's bigger.
police coming with chainsaws and cutting their houses down and telling them to get out. Right.
Do you find that from place to place, we all have our own set of problems that impacts how people kind of deal with sea rise, like in Lagos where there are more dangerous issues, or in, I don't know.
Sure. It's always the problem with climate stuff, these sort of long-term, slow-moving catastrophes that require thoughtful long-term planning, and long-term thinking about risk are crowded out, especially in our media world, by events of the moment. And obviously we have a tragic example of this just here now. And not that these other events shouldn't get attention, of course they should, but it's very hard for for people and for our political kind of body politic to track both things. And President Trump is artful. He's certainly not the only one, but he's particularly artful at using crises as distractions from other more complex conversations and problems that need to be dealt with. And so that's I would say, one of the most difficult things about grappling with this problem is how do you, when you have politicians who are on election cycles, you have developers who are on 5-year time horizons, you have homeowners who are moving every 6 or 7 years, how do you get people to think about long-term complex things that are really not sexy, like infrastructure, like sewage, like moving airports, things like that that are going to have to be done in a context where you're getting distracted every minute by the new crisis that's unfolding somewhere, or your Twitter feed, and it's.
Do you find that that's a uniquely American kind of because of our political process, or do you see it in other places too? I noticed some of the examples that you know, where they've done, you know, the Netherlands with they've built these huge infrastructure projects. I think about here in South Florida, we can't even get Everglades restoration done.
Right. Well, I mean, the Netherlands has 1,000 years of inertia of sort of thinking about this. And so, you know, here we have a lot of problems with, you know, different, just political and legal problems with, like, you know, different authorities, different agencies, who's in charge, you know, the fight in New York over the subways,
Right.
and who's going to, you know, who has the authority over the subway that goes, or the train tunnel that goes from Jersey to New York. They'll fight about that for 40 years, about the infrastructure, just about the agency who's in charge. The thing that you see when you go to other countries and talk about this is that climate denialism is basically a very American phenomenon. You do not see, you know, the same kind of, you know, political figures holding a snowball in Congress and saying, see, you know, there's no such thing as global warming. So I think that is the most powerful and biggest difference in everywhere that I've traveled for this book and otherwise on climate. Even in China, I've spent a ton of time in China. You don't find climate deniers in China. You find people who, you know, hope that the government doesn't decide to, you know, open a coal plant next to them or something like that. But you don't find climate deniers. That's the American
Right.
thing.
And I know that you were finishing this book and writing this book just as the election was unfolding. Have you reached out to anybody in the Trump administration? How do you, you know?
Oh, they're very happy to hear from me.
I
Yes. No, the Trump administration, I mean, I'm not sure who there is to reach out to, but you know, I mean, I have tried to talk with Scott Pruitt a number of times, and yeah, and you know, so they're obviously not interested in engagement on this in any way. I mean, and you know, it's easy to bash the Trump administration, and I will certainly can do that for a long time. But the upside of it is that the pushback is bringing a lot of people into politics on this issue and other issues that may, in the long run, be a very potent thing. You know, I mean, just like the New York Times readership is way up, not obviously just on climate and environmental stuff, but you know, Sierra Club membership is way up. A lot of kids, anecdotally, that I know, my own daughter is getting involved in college in political and environmental stuff because she's so outraged about what she's seeing. So in the long run, there may be, you know, this may be a weird kind of blessing for awareness around this stuff.
Well, and do you, when I started covering climate change in, you know, 2014, the things were turning, but it felt like under the Obama administration, it didn't really get going until his last 2 years. And I wonder, do you think that he waited too long? I know you spent some time with them and talked about it. And you know, I remember getting frustrated thinking, you know, it just seemed like it was a little late in the game.
Oh yeah, I mean, he totally whiffed the entire, he had a great opportunity right after he was elected to get a cap and trade legislation through or some kind of carbon tax through. All the sort of pieces were aligned. It looked like it was going to happen. He talked about it in the campaign, and then he just, you know, decided to do healthcare. Basically decided he couldn't do both, decided to do healthcare. May or may not have been the right reason. But then that moment where we might have gotten a price on carbon through Congress passed, and it never kind of came again because of the midterm losses in Congress. And so, and he basically, and I wrote very critically of him in his first administration that he not only didn't push any legislation, he went silent. He didn't even talk about it. And, you know, he didn't talk about it that much on the first campaign trail, but enough that, you know, it was obviously something that he was on his radar and things. But then, in the second term, he changed, and I went with him to Alaska for 3 days. Spent an hour and a half in a little 8th grade classroom in Kotzebue, Alaska, above the Arctic Circle, sitting in 2 little blue chairs with like handmade snowballs hanging above us. Just him and I talking about climate change. And, I have a really good bullshit detector for people who read notes about climate change and think that they understand it versus people who actually do understand both the science and the politics of it. And I found my conversation with him really remarkable in that respect. And he really understood what this was about in many ways. And I think that he really pushed hard for Paris. And I think that he did an amazing thing getting the diplomacy to get China, doing the diplomacy to get China to kind of buy into this, to get out of their developing nations status and to kind of accept responsibility for their emissions, which basically allowed the Paris Agreement to happen. And I think he deserves a ton of credit for that. He put a lot of political muscle into that. Does that make up for what he didn't do in the first term? I don't know. Do we wish he did more? Of course. But of course now all that's going somewhere else.
Yeah, yeah. So, because we're in Miami and we like to talk about ourselves, how do you think we fall? How do we rank in terms of all these other places that you've been to in as far as addressing and responding? We have, I think, sometimes to me it feels like it's been a lot of planning, slow to act. Miami Beach, rush to get some infrastructure put in. From where I sat, it didn't really address. I mean, I'm an environmental reporter, so I'm always looking at environmental impacts. And as I was reading your book too, it seemed like there are a lot of places that are addressing resiliency and infrastructure, and I kept asking myself, is anybody looking at the consequences and the impact of the environment? When you wall off a city, what happens to outside the wall?
Yeah.
Sorry, there was a couple of questions in there.
Well, I think walls are very, as you pointed out, I think that, not that applies so much to here in Miami, because I don't think that because of the limestone base and everything, I don't think that
it wouldn't work.
Yeah, that we're going to see, big sort of fortress Miami structures here, unlike you will see probably in New York and parts of Boston and places like that. But walls are a big problem because besides, the Dutch talk about this when I was there, about how they regret all of the walling that they've done because it basically killed off basically the entire ecosystems around these walls and their inland sea. And so they have this new, their idea now is sort of this idea of living with water more and figuring out ways to not wall it off, but to live with it. And the bigger problem with walls is, or not bigger, but a different and very equally profound problem with walls is the whole question of who's behind it and who's not. I mean, you see that very clearly in New York with this thing called the Big U that they're planning to put around Lower Manhattan, which is, runs basically from about 42nd Street on the east side all the way around Lower Manhattan to 42nd Street on the west side. And they hate it when I call it a wall. They prefer it to be called a barrier with amenities. So this barrier with amenities will circle Lower Manhattan, and no one knows exactly how much it will cost. $8 billion, something like that. No one knows exactly who's going to pay for it either, but it's eventually going to get built. I'm certain of it because this is the most valuable real estate in the world, and you have a lot of money in New York, and it's inevitably. But it's cool if you live on like 39th Street. If you live on like 47th Street, you're like, well, why can't you make the wall go 2 more blocks?
Where's my wall?
Because you're building this big thing anyway. I'm just right there, And then that's one thing. And then if you live in Red Hook, Brooklyn, you're like, well, why don't you have Danish architects coming over and building walls for us in Red Hook? And it's like, people in Red Hook are going to have to wait a very long time before they get, really hip Danish architects building walls in Red Hook. So there's huge social equity problems with this that people in New York are aware of, but inevitably they're going to build it anyway.
Right.
Because one of the tough things about climate in general, but at sea level rise in particular, is that, you know, there are kind of the saved and the damned. And it's going to increase social inequities in many, many different ways.
Right, right. And when people are planning this infrastructure, though, or do you sense that in other places they're thinking about the environmental? I mean, it just feels like it's and sometimes here in Miami, we like to build, and this is just a way to keep
You like
building.
to build in Miami, really?
But you know, it's
Yeah,
just
yeah.
a way to make it more possible for, you know, for us to remain and to continue and to bring more people. I know you talked about the issue of retreat, which is something that has come up, but nobody really likes to talk about
Right.
here.
It's a very dirty word.
State that's, you know,
Right.
as you said, no state income tax. We depend on property taxes.
Right. Right.
So, I mean, what do you think? I
About-
mean, is the retreat, and also, I mean, again, a couple of questions in there. Environmental impacts and in the rush to make things resilient, are we going to screw up the planet even more?
I think that on the environmental impacts, I think that environmental impacts are, sad to say, a kind of luxury in this conversation. I think that for sea level rise, a lot of it is about, you know, sheer economics. Unfortunately, I think it would be a much better conversation if there was more thinking about the environment. And I mean, there is a whole movement among architects and city planners of sort of building with nature in ways that it is very encouraging and will hopefully lead to kind of less walling off and more embrace. Like one of the projects that won the design contest after Hurricane Sandy has to do with a breakwater off Staten Island. That the whole point of it is it's not going to stop sea level rise, but it's a sort of a breakwater that will help, you know, break the waves and slow the impact of storm surges and things. But it's really remarkable because they're really doing it as a kind of designing it in ways to make it much more of a natural habitat, to bring in oysters, to bring in seals, all kinds of things. But also, more importantly, to draw people back to the water, to living with water, and building houses that are in this sort of lagoon-like area, and making people less sort of afraid of water. So I think that kind of thing is encouraging. What was the second?
The
Retreat.
the
Oh,
thing
well.
we shall not talk about.
You know, it's a hard thing to say in a place like this, like Miami, but it is just true that the solution to rising seas is going to be moving to higher ground, because defending low ground is just going to be more and more expensive and more difficult, and the economics are just, to anyone who thinks clearly about this, it's very obvious. I mean, you just can't protect everything, no matter, even if the geology and things kind of allow that, it's just not going to happen. And so the sooner we bend our mind around that, the better, because we need to think about retreating in a coherent way and about, I mean, I was at a big National Historical Preservation Society the other day, and the conversation was, which lighthouses are we going to save? You know, we can save X number of lighthouses that we care about, but the rest of them, we don't have the money, we're never gonna have the money, so we have to do a kind of triage. What do we really care about? And I think you're gonna have to do the same thing in Miami. I mean, there's going to, be a kind of triage moments where what are we gonna do about the art, South Beach, the Art Deco buildings and things there? What are we gonna do about places that are clearly going to be flooded out early, like, South Miami-Dade? How much money are we gonna put in there? How many roads are we gonna keep fixing? How much sewage money and infrastructure are we gonna spend in those places?
And who will be making those decisions? Is this a matter of insurance and, or, government saying we're not going to, like use a city outside St. Augustine, there was a legal case that I thought was really interesting where the county said, we're not throwing away money anymore rebuilding
Right.
old A1A
Right.
when it keeps washing away.
Right. But in that case, there was a group of property owners who were wealthy and had a lot of political clout, and was basically, this is an area near St. Augustine where there was about 50 homes on the coast with one road that got to allow access to the coast, to the homes, and the road kept washing out over years, and the county basically said, we can't afford to keep fixing this. You know, we're spending, I don't remember what the numbers were, but $12 million a year or something. This road keeps eroding. We can't keep doing this because we have other roads we have to fix. And the homeowners sued the county and said, you built this road, you've been maintaining it for X number of years. You're failing to maintain this road amounts to a taking of our property, because our property is valueless if we don't have an access road. So you have to keep fixing it. And went to court, and they ended up working out an arrangement. And you know, they're kind of both paying some of it now, but it's inevitable that this road is going to go. And in fact, I was just there a few months ago, and it's pretty much gone now anyway. But those kinds of conversations are going to become more and more central, because you can't afford to fix everything that needs to be fixed. You know, $6 billion for sewage and storm water drainage improvements and getting rid of septic systems in Miami-Dade, or some number like that. I mean, where's that money going to come from, and who's going to get it? And unfortunately, in these kinds of conversations, the people who are best connected, best politically organized, and often wealthiest are the ones who get their concerns heard. Mm-hmm. You know, I mean, we're certainly not going to, like, you know, just like in Manhattan, they're not going to let Wall Street go under. I mean, if that wall there costs $3 billion or $6 billion or $9 billion or $12 billion, they're going to build that wall. Right?
I mean, don't you think that in Miami, though, that same argument will be made? I mean, I've heard you know, if the more we build, higher property taxes can help pay for some of these efforts.
I think you're going to see a lot of developers say, look, you know, you have zoning requirements here, you know, height requirements, historic buildings, whatever, you know, but they're low, they're vulnerable, let me tear them down. Well, I'll build you something new, it'll be higher, it'll be more resilient, it'll double the property values, and that's, you know, that's going to happen. So one friend of mine described it as a kind of disaster capitalism, mm-hmm. you know, which I don't think it's like such a, I mean, I think it's real, but I also think that there's some virtue in that, you know. I mean, that's a way to build out through this, you know. But it's not going to work in, you know, Sweetwater.
Right.
I mean, you know, there's not going to, it's going to happen in places like where the real estate value is high and where the people kind of, so I'm very concerned about Hialeah, Sweetwater, places like that, where not only is there no attention or money, but there's no awareness of risk, mm-hmm. right? Especially here in Miami, the idea that the water will be coming in from both sides is really important to think about. It'll be coming in from the Everglades as well as coming in. In fact, it even kind of comes in, if you look at the modeling, it even comes in from the Everglades a little bit faster. So places like Sweetwater, Hialeah, Doral, all those places are really at risk. And people there don't know that, right? And so they just think, oh, I'm 7 miles from the beach, I'm okay. It floods here a lot when it rains, but they don't think about it, you know. And so I think that a lot of people have a lot of money in their houses, and the classic American dream thing, right. where their houses with their savings bank are hugely at risk.
Right. Now, you had an alarming statistic: 200 million climate refugees by 2050. That's a
yeah.
That's a big number. So let's talk about Greenland. And I wanted you to talk about Greenland because you know, for us it's such a faraway place, but it's also that's the you know, the thing we've heard the most about. I had this idea like of all the places you've been, like what's the thing that's happened most recently that's most alarming to you? And my guess is what you saw in Greenland, but maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah. Greenland was incredibly interesting, and I went to Greenland a couple of times, once right after leaving Miami, and to go on those giant ice sheets and to see these, the calving at these glaciers as they slide into the ocean I took a helicopter and flew right along the calving front, which was even more thrilling than flying along the shore here. But what was really profound there was I went there the first time right after I was here, and I thought, this is what's ultimately going to cause the problems that I just was thinking about in Miami. I mean, this is why Miami Beach and many other places around the world are going to go under, is because of this massive calving that I'm watching right here. And so one of the hard things to bend your mind around with climate change in general is that, and this sounds like a cliche, but the sort of connectedness of the world. That what happens in a place as remote as Greenland has an impact right here. And so that I watched these glaciers calve into the sea, and I could almost imagine the water getting a little higher on Miami Beach, and that profound sense that this giant world, so complex, so many mechanisms, so much life to it, is really one system. And what happens in a distant place matters. And that's the hard thing about climate change, is because you in Miami Beach can all decide you're going to ride skateboards to work and recycle everything and be the best citizens ever, and it doesn't matter. I mean, it matters in the sense of, as an example to the world, it matters morally, it matters ethically, but as far as the amount of CO2 that goes into the atmosphere, would be dwarfed by one coal plant or 2 coal plants in India. I mean, so it's a real global problem that is what makes it so difficult to deal with.
Right.
Yeah. But the scariest place, when it comes to sea level rise, the scariest place hands down is West Antarctica, which I have not been to. But there's, I don't want to go all geeky on science, and I know there's a lot of great scientists here who understand this far better than I do. But the most recent sort of ice science, and the reason that these projections for potential sea level rise keep growing, 10 years ago, the high end was, 3 feet, 1 meter or so by the end of the century. Now NOAA is up around 7 feet, and the high end keeps getting higher, is because the risk of West Antarctica, there are very large ice sheets that sit on like sort of the edge of a bowl of soup, like a soup bowl. The continent is shaped like a soup bowl, and as these giant ice sheets are sitting on this grounding line, this edge, warmer water is starting to get under the grounding line, melting the glaciers from below. There's potential for large collapse of these giant ice sheets that is a different dynamic than the sliding of ice sheets and surface melt in Greenland. And so one of the mechanisms for scientists think about for big sea level rise in the past may be this collapse of West Antarctica. And that's something that, just in the last 10 years, 5 years even, has really become more and more kind of apparent. And that, for me, in reporting this book, is the sort of scariest thing, because there have been periods in the past, at the end of the last ice age, when we had 12 feet of sea level rise in a century. And if we got anything like that now, that would be obviously catastrophic. Not saying that we would, but there's a mechanism there that makes that kind of thing possible.
When part of the book, you were in Aspen, and there was, I guess, some kind of convention of scientists where you were talking about possible solutions, and I remember there was the shooting some kind of particles. What do you make of those kinds of, they almost sound like shortcuts or quick fixes, so we wouldn't have to deal with the emissions issue and the greenhouse gases, and do you think those are realistic, or is that just grasping at straws because dealing with greenhouse gases has just become such a difficult issue.
Yeah, that's sort of what people call the Frankenplanet solution.
Right.
Right. Which I wrote a book about prior, and the short version of it, just for people who don't know, is geoengineering, this notion that you could cool the planet by creating essentially artificial volcanoes. We know from the eruption of Mount Pinatubo and other work that when a volcano erupts, it puts a lot of tiny aerosols high into the stratosphere. Those little particles act as reflectors, essentially. And after Pinatubo, the temperature of the Earth was lowered by about 1.5 degrees for a couple of years. And so there's some thinking that we could do the same thing to lower the temperature of the planet now. It's the mechanics of it, the engineering of it is not complicated. It would just take a handful of high-altitude airplanes and some spraying devices. They start flying around up high, and they spread these particles, and all of a sudden the planet cools off. And this sounds sort of like a kind of elaborate chemtrails conspiracy, but it's actually, there is a chemtrails conspiracy, which drives me crazy, but this is not a chemtrails conspiracy. This is a real thing. No one is doing it yet. But there's been a lot of modeling, and it's certainly possible. And I think it's inevitable, sadly. But it's not a quick fix. It leaves a lot of other problems, among them, you're not lowering the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. You're just cooling off the amount of heat that is coming in from the sun, basically. And so buildup of CO2 in the atmosphere has all kinds of other problems, like ocean acidification is the worst of them. And then there's also the problem that if you stop flying the airplanes around, the particles will all drop out of the sky. And if you've been doing this for a number of years, it's like closing a parasol, and all of a sudden, wow, it's hot, right? So there, you have to, once you start it, you have to kind of keep doing it. So there's that problem. But, you know, I think it's inevitable because for a number of reasons, I think that it's certainly cheap, and it can be done by people who talk about this politically, talk about a green finger, somebody who, like, you know, not to pick on Bill Gates, but Bill Gates could easily do this with, like, you know, not easily, and just decide, you know what, nations of the world are so screwed up in, like, they're never going to cut CO2 emissions, planet's going to hell, I'm just going to buy a couple of airplanes and start flying around and cool things off and deal with this. Bill would not do this, but, you know, you can imagine some half-crazy billionaire in, you know, remote China just deciding he was going to save things.
Yeah.
So we can talk more about this in questions if you want, but I do think that there's a sad inevitability to it. And I do not endorse it, but I'm just...
It's maybe I'm being naive, but that kind of completely engineered world.
Yeah, but we live in a completely engineered world now. I mean, it's like the question is, are we going to get better at it, you know? And I mean, we are engineering the climate by every time you start up your car and every time we build a coal plant. I mean, that's what we're doing now. It's not like it's like we've arrived on this virgin planet and we're trying to decide should we fuck it up or not. It's more like, you know, we've already messed things up. Can we get better at, like, not messing it up? And maybe this can be a tool that might help. And I have reservations about it, but I think it's not quite as scary as it first sounds.
Yeah.
If it's done right.
So what is...
We're getting the
Are we? Oh, okay.
questions.
Well, we can do the Q&A now. I didn't have a great follow-up question. So does anyone have questions? There we go.
Do we have a microphone? No, great. So questions.
Fascinating, thank you. I have a really, from the position of complete naivete and ignorance, I am curious, because you mentioned Venice. I was privileged to visit Venice. Is there a noticeable difference in the water level already in Venice? And a really stupid idea, which maybe isn't as wonderful as flying crystals, but something I wondered, I mean, like China is, you know, building countries in the middle of the ocean. can't we just put like a big conveyor belt digging out more of the ocean bottom and throwing it onto our shores here, just to like build it up? Or is
Well,
that,
that's sort of how Miami was built. I mean, that's,
why can't we go back to what we did a long time ago?
And I remember at one point in the book you said we've gained more land mass in the last
Yeah.
30 years than we've lost. So.
yeah, the Chinese are, of course, in the South Pacific are doing this. I mean, the Maldives are doing this, building more land. In Lagos, where I went, they're building a whole, but they're calling the Abu Dhabi of Africa. No, the Dubai. Sorry, not Abu Dhabi. Dubai of Africa. By building a 3-mile square kind of island. You know, so yes, we'll be doing a lot of this kind of stuff, but that doesn't really help you if you're on, you know, if you're in Sweetwater or in Norfolk, or, you know, I mean, so I think there's going to be all kinds of really interesting creative solutions to this. You know, I know lots of architects who have lots of ideas about platform cities and about floating this and floating that, and, you know, pontoons. And I mean, I went in Lagos, you know, a really great Nigerian architect built this incredible floating community center, really beautiful, just out of 55-gallon drums and simple wood, and everyone loved it. I mean, I think there's just all kinds of great ways that we're going to live with water. The problem is we have all this stuff already built that is at risk, and what's going to happen to that? And so, you know, we're not going to like bulldoze Miami and then say, okay, now we're going to build a city that is like suitable for sea level rise.
Although
right?
there was a quote from a developer, I think.
Yeah, well, that's the sort of, that's what I was talking about before. It's like, this is going to let me knock down a lot of junk and build new stuff. And so I know a number of developers who are, you know, not unhappy about this.
Yeah, hi, John Van Leer from University of Miami here. I'm a supporter of citizen climate lobbies, fee and dividend refund policy. Would you comment on what you think about that?
You're talking about for carbon.
Carbon fee and dividend.
Right. So just to explain, this is an idea, you know, there's a lot of ideas. I mean, almost everyone who's involved in climate change politics who wants to solve the problem, not solve the problem, because there are a lot of people involved in it who have that agenda also, agree that a price on carbon is the ultimate solution to this, to keep, you know, to accelerate the transformation to clean energy and all of that. And we've been trying to do this for 25 years. It's been clear. Worked on the acid rain program, a cap and trade program. So it's basically cap and trade idea, which was the acid rain. There's a straight carbon tax, which is a tax on the amount of carbon that comes out of the ground, basically. And then there's this idea of tax and dividend, which is a combination of a tax. There's various ideas. The one I'm most familiar with is the one that...
Yeah, it's a fee and dividend. So,
fee and dividend, right.
Yeah, so it's not a tax because the government doesn't keep it.
Right. Okay, fee and dividend. But so it's been talked about in a number of different ways, but basically it's, you know, the idea is you put a fee on carbon and then it gets given back to everybody. So if we collect $2 billion in carbon fees, it's given back to citizens in some proportion to either equally, or there's various scenarios, but it's basically a redistribution of money. There's no money being taken by the government. There's no using this funds for development, for anything else. It's straightforward, and it should have a lot of political support, because we're basically saying we're going to give you a paycheck. You know, we're going to take money away from, you know, the coal industry, and we're going to give money to you. But it's not very, I mean, and so there's a lot of people, I mean, the question is the political viability of it, and I think it's a great idea, and I would totally support it, but I just don't know how politically viable it is, certainly in our current climate, where you have the power of lobbyists is so profound that they're not going to let a big pot of money like that go straight to you and me.
Yeah, well, we're citizen lobbyists. There's about 100,000 of us, and we have a voice too.
Go.
Thank you.
We need 500,000.
Hello, I'm Mark Hebert, and I work in a local municipality. And my question involves migration, since that was a part of the topic of your book in general. And I'm fascinated with the aspects of retreat from an area like here, because people will decide that I'm flooding too frequently, the neighborhood is diminishing, people are moving out, I'm going to go too. So there would be a number of factors pushing people out, as well as maybe factors around the area, around the country, pulling them in. And Mayor Stoddard, the mayor of South Miami, has come up with some ideas, one of which is in negotiating with communities elsewhere in the country. He had spoken with the mayor in South Carolina, I believe it was, about investing money into the communities to build out their infrastructure, to build out their community, awaiting climate refugees from South Florida. And I'm wondering what other migration channels, if you will, or methods you may have encountered in the course of the book.
Well, I think migration is a huge issue. I think it's very it's inevitable. People are going to leave. I've been doing a lot of thinking about this because it's something that I think is something I want to explore more. And I was actually, just a couple weeks ago, I had some interesting conversations with people who were studying the Dust Bowl and what happened there and how the migration patterns work there. The interesting thing I learned from talking to some of these demographers and social scientists at University of Chicago especially, is that they argue that during the Dust Bowl, people could have adapted. There was like ways of like changing their farming patterns and tools and crops and done things, but they were too ingrained in their own habits and too ingrained in the way things that they had been doing. They just decided it was easier to leave. And I think that there's going to be a lot of that. It's just going to be, to hell with this, I'm tired of flooding, I'm going to Asheville, you know? And I have been actually starting to report on this, and I was in Arizona recently with my daughter, and we went to Flagstaff, and I talked to the mayor of Flagstaff, and she's very aware of this. They're getting a lot of refugees there, well, not refugees, but people who are moving for climate-related reasons. And she's like, well, you know, this is bringing up a lot of problems for us because not only is there the infrastructure stuff, but also the gentrification issues, you know, of like you're pushing out people who in lower income neighborhoods and all the kind of stuff that anyone who thinks about development is familiar with. But I think that's already happening. And I think that, you know, how that is going to get managed is really interesting. And I don't know, it'd be cool if it'd be smart, and Phil Stoddard is really thoughtful about all this. I'm a big fan of how he thinks in general about all this. He's one of the most proactive and straight-talking political figures in America on this issue, I would say. But whether we can develop relationships with like, okay, I'm going to lose 50,000 people to sea level rise. South Carolina, can you take them? You know, I mean, maybe bidding for people. I don't know. I mean, I don't know how that's going to work. But you know, I was just in Asheville on my book tour, and I met an incredible amount of people who had said, I moved here because the Outer Banks were just like, I've had enough. I know I need to sell. I need, you know, and Asheville's, you know, it's not the Outer Banks, but it's like a nice second. So, and I think that that's going to happen a lot. I think you'll see, of course, migration even like in a place like Florida, people not only moving to higher ground in, say, Orlando, although that's got its own problems, but even like, you know, 5 foot higher elevation in various parts of the city values of real estate will change as those values become sort of added into the economics, you know. You know, it's, now we think about a home, it's like a 5-bedroom home, 4 bathrooms, air conditioning, this, that, marble tile, and elevation of 13 feet. And instead of elevation of 7 feet or 3 feet. And that, you know, the elevation number, I think, is going to actually be a number that people like look at as a part of the value of their homes or the real estate they want to buy.
I'm curious too, given Florida's history, you know, we've had hurricanes after Andrew, people fled South Dade, they moved up to Broward, and it seems like as long as someone's willing to buy the land, they'll come.
Right.
And maybe that's the kind of the way people change that you're talking about, like in the Dust Bowl. Maybe the next wave that comes in will live differently than the people who've left. But as somebody who's a lifelong native, it's really hard to get my head around the fact that people would leave South Florida. I mean, maybe
Yeah.
I'm just being naive,
Well,
but
I mean,
it's just hard to, given my whole life down here, I just, you know, there's always somebody coming, you know, somebody next in line.
Well, I mean, that's the great thing about capitalism, right? I mean,
Yeah.
people find uses for things in different ways that, I mean, I don't think that, I mean, obviously this is a sort of slow rolling story. But, you know, what does Fort Lauderdale look like with 5 feet of sea level rise? I mean, and that's a modest number, right? But what does it look like? I mean, I don't know, but it's not going to look like what it looks like today, right? It's going to be a very different place, and there's going to be a lot of real estate that's going to be underwater. Not like Atlantis, but I mean where, you know, 5 feet will flood a lot of Fort Lauderdale. And are those houses all going to be elevated? Are the roads going to be elevated? You know, is the airport going to be, I mean, how is that whole infrastructure going to work? And I don't know what the
We're all
future-
waiting to see, right?
Well, but I mean, it's going to be interesting because it's going to happen. I mean, that's the hard thing for me communicating with this book and why it's called The Water Will Come, not The Water Will Come Unless We All Get Solar Panels, is that there is a certain inevitability to this. You know, the trajectories can change depending on emissions and all that, but sea level rise is baked in right now, and so I don't know.
Can I ask you to comment on the influence of the seawater rise on the aquifer and the availability of drinking water?
Well, I mean, that's obviously a big issue here in Miami-Dade, as most of you probably know quite well, that as the salt water rises, the sea rises, it pushes into the drinking water aquifers. You know, it doesn't take very much salt water into a drinking water aquifer to render it essentially undrinkable. It's a huge problem. Keep moving the wells back, drilling wells, but then as the water comes in from the west, you get less and less area where you can't keep moving west. So that's a big issue here. And it's a big issue in other places, especially the Pacific Islands, like the Marshall Islands. That's a huge issue also, because freshwater drinking is, they have these like freshwater lenses that supply most of the drinking water on a lot of these Pacific Islands, and they're having the same problem of saltwater infiltration. But I'm not, even though I grew up in Silicon Valley and worked at Apple when Steve Jobs was barefoot and dropping acid, I'm not a big I don't think technology is going to solve all of our problems, but I do think that desalination technology is, you know, right now it's expensive and big and all that, but I think there's going to be a lot of advances in that. And so I don't think that for wealthy areas especially, that the drinking water problem is going to be the sort of game stopper, the game showstopper kind of thing. I think it's going to be a problem that's going to be dealt with technology, with conservation, with, you know, recycling water. Nobody wants to talk about that either. They want to think about, you know, recycling water, but they're starting to talk about it more and more. And the recycling water means that, you know, you take the water that you use and you clean it, basically, and reuse it again. They're starting to talk about that seriously in the Southwest now. So I just think that there's solutions for that in the way that there aren't for, you know, 5 feet of water on LAX or on Miami International runways and things like that, and on the highways.
Hi, hello, Jeff. My name is Luis Rodriguez, and I'm a biological sonographer and a long-time environmental and climate change activist in the community. And first of all, I'd like to thank you for all that you do and for for bringing such an important issue into the general public. But my question is, so do you think then that are we too late, or it is too soon, or it is time for our political leaders to start discussing the potential, planned relocation or evacuation of certain areas in our community?
Well, I mean, I don't think it's certainly time for evacuation, but, sorry?
Start a discussion.
Yes, I mean, I do think, I know from my reporting here that it's already happening in quiet ways. I mean, I do think this idea of a kind of triage, of deciding where we're going to invest, where we're not going to invest, is already beginning to happen and is going to happen more and more quickly as this impacts escalate. And that's the hard political conversation to have, because no politician wants to say, oh, well, all you folks out here, you're below 1 foot of elevation, and we're really sorry that you decided to buy a house out there. But you did, and we can't afford to run a new sewer line out there, or we're not going to keep up these roads, or there's, eventually those kinds of decisions are going to have to be made in some way. And I think that the sooner, but before we even get to that, we have to stop building stuff in risky places. It's like this classic thing of when you're in a hole, stop digging. I mean, you're still, in Miami-Dade here, you're still building a whole lot of stuff in incredibly risky areas. And, yes, some of the buildings are more resilient. There's small changes in building code that have given more elevation and things like that. Better hurricane resilience, but you're still building huge amounts of development in places that are doomed. And so even before the sort of triage of what we're going to say that's already built, it would be a good idea to start thinking clearly about where we should be building now, right? And stop that, so at least the problem isn't getting worse. But that's a hard conversation, because that means development restrictions, and that's not a popular topic here, right?
Well, I want to thank you, Jeff and Jenny, for a fantastic conversation. And